Hi, I'm John Mahoney from Streaming Alchemy. In this video, we're going to take a detailed look at the Move 4K camera over here. This is a new camera from PTZOptics that does 4K 60, it does auto tracking, and has a range of both IP and physical connections for integrating in your studio. So let's get started. Let's focus in first on some of the I/O capabilities that are found in this camera. And if we look at the rear of the connections on the camera, you'll see we can start with audio. We have a line in and line out for audio. So what this will let you do is take a line level audio signal, embed it into the camera so it can be embedded into SDI, NDI, or HDMI as a video audio pair with the signal that's coming directly from the camera. So that gives you a lot of flexibility for how you want to route audio in your productions. The next thing to look at will be the two physical connections for video and, in this case, audio as well, if you have it embedded. So the first is a SDI connection. So the SDI connection on this camera is a 3G SDI connection, which means that it can go up to 1080p 60. So even though it's a 4K camera, using SDI, you will be limited to 1080p 60. Next to it, though, is an HDMI. So it's an HDMI 2.0 port. The HDMI does go up to 4K 60, so you can get a full resolution from this camera out of HDMI. So the next thing, though, is to start to look at the digital side. Those are the physical connections, but the digital connections are really equally powerful. So the main one you're going to be dealing with will basically be your network connection. This network connection is going to allow you to handle control signals. So this can be VSCR over IP, it can be NDI. It will let you do NDI HX output, RTMP output, SRT output. The NDI HX and the SRT can both go up to 4K 60 as well. So again, a set of digital options to mirror the options that are available in the physical connections. The other thing which is interesting for this is that it also comes with a USB 2.0 connection to use this camera as a webcam. So that's a whole other area where if you want to use this for more of your traditional conferencing software, use it with Live to Air, use it with Zoom, any of those types of capabilities, you can do that as well, where this looks like a webcam to the software that is leveraging it. The other thing to point out that I didn't mention before is that this camera is powered over PoE through the network connection. So having that connection will allow you to run a single cable to this camera, giving you power, video, and audio feeds. So again, very convenient and ideal for the types of modern studio setups that people are using in the digital space. So the last thing, which is more around the traditional way of controlling a PTZ camera, is that it does come with RS-232 in and out. So that gives you sort of that VSCA connection that you get, the physical connection. And it also comes with an RS-485 connection, which basically gives you those same VSCA connections, but just over a longer physical cable. So a lot of capabilities baked into this camera in terms of I/O and control. So the next thing I'd like to talk about are the optics inside the camera. And for this discussion, I'm going to be talking about the 20X version of the Move 4K. There is a 12X and a 30X version as well. Their specs will be slightly different, but sort of as the mid-tier camera in this range of Move 4Ks, this will give you a good idea of the general capabilities of this line. So in the 20X camera, it uses a Sony CMOS sensor, a half-inch Sony CMOS sensor, which really has an excellent reputation in the industry. And that has an effective pixel count of about 8.5 million pixels. The lens on the camera, it runs from about a 6.25 millimeter to 125 millimeter. And that is based on the half-inch sensor size. if you made this into an equivalent for a full frame, sort of a 35 millimeter equivalent, what you'd end up with is something around a 30 millimeter to just under a 600 millimeter focal range. And so that, should cover most scenarios that you need, using the 20x camera. The other piece, though, is the aperture size. So the aperture, if we go to full frame equivalents, this will run somewhere around an f7.5 to an f19. So that gives you sort of a sense of the lens optics in here for, equivalents for how it could deal with light, depth of field, other things like that. The other piece to this that's interesting will be the resolution. So under HDMI, you are able to get the 4K resolution, 60, 59, 9.4, 50, 30, 29, 9.7, and 25. So it covers a good range of frame rates for the resolution at 4K. SDI and HDMI, since the SDI is 3G, that will also cover 1080p 60 and all the other frame rates down to 25. Interestingly, this camera also covers 1080i with 60, 59, 9.4, and 50 frame rates. So it covers the interlace as well as the progressive, though that is probably less important for most of today's productions. In addition, this camera also supports 1280 by 720 at 60 frames and 59.94. So a fairly broad range of resolutions that are available and the frame rates for that. This camera, because we talk about it as a 20x camera, but this camera also includes digital zoom. And, the challenge with digital zoom is that you always end up with basically lower resolution as you push beyond the optical limits of the camera. So this goes, I think, all the way up to 8x digital zoom. But that would probably not be something, in terms of quality that I would typically recommend. I typically recommend staying within the optical zoom range. But there's an interesting capability in this camera. If you are using the camera as a 1080p camera, if you're using sort of just that piece of the sensor, you actually can go 2x into that, an additional doubling. So basically a 40x camera zoom in 1080, staying full resolution, because that extra doubling of focal length is coming to you via extra pixels that you have available because you're not using a 4K, you're only using 1080. So the camera is able to use those additional pixels to effectively zoom in, and that's without any resolution loss. So that's a powerful feature to keep in mind, especially if you think that you're going to be using it as a 1080 camera. That really makes this camera into a 40x camera. So an impressive zoom range without any optical loss if you stay within 1080. So the other piece in this, in addition, beyond just the zoom rate, is the field of view. And so this has basically a 60-degree field of view in the horizontal. So that's sort of if you look at how wide your image will be when you work at it. So you're basically dealing with about 60.7 degree field of view. And vertically, it's about a 34 degree field of view. The other thing is the shutter speed in this. The shutter speeds go from a 30th of a second up to 1/10,000th of a second. Now, that's probably not necessarily going to be optically pleasing when you get to, the 1/10,000th. They probably need an enormous amount of light to make that work, but it is technically capable within the camera. The other thing to keep in mind is that the tilt in the camera. So this is a PTZ camera. So the tilt in terms of how this camera can move, it can go 90 degrees. It's basically points straight up to the ceiling. And it can go 30 degrees down. So if you're mounting this higher up, you'd have to keep in mind that you have a 30-degree limit for the downward tilt inside the camera. The other thing that this camera does support optically is the ability to flip the image or to mirror the image. And that can be very valuable based on how you have to mount the camera. So if you're mounting it upside down, sort of ceiling mount and doing it, having those types of flips and mirrors can be very useful. So the optics in this are fairly comprehensive and definitely cover a lot of common scenarios that these cameras would be used for. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the IP streaming capabilities inside this camera. And really, let's talk first here about the codecs that it supports, because it's really a pretty broad range. So this camera supports H.264. It supports H.265, basically HEVC. It supports MJPEG, which is another protocol commonly used. Natively, it supports NDI-HX. And now there are two flavors of that. And I'll go into this in a moment, but there's NDI-HX2 and HX3. And they do behave differently. So we'll touch on that in a moment. But in addition, this camera also supports RTMP, RTSP, and probably also significant, it supports SRT. So you have the ability with this camera alone to stream from a remote location across the internet into a central control room. So some of the ideal capabilities that people are looking for with remote productions, that's built into this camera and supported directly from that. SRT, also we did some testing with this, that will support 4K remotely. So something to keep in mind. You have fairly high bandwidth that can come out of this, and with the SRT and 4K, that gives you top quality resolution across the internet. So something to keep in mind. But let's now talk a little bit about the two flavors of NDI. So NDI, when it originally came out, had what we now call sort of full bandwidth NDI. So full bandwidth NDI, if you're looking at something like a 1080p signal, you're probably talking about 150 megabits for 1080p 60. So to give you a sense of the network traffic generated by full bandwidth NDI. Later, NDI HX came out, and its follow-on HX2, which was sort of a refinement of that protocol. That requires far less bandwidth, but has a few compromises. So that 1080p signal at 150 megabits now is less than 20 megabits when you go probably closer to 15 megabits for a 1080p 60 signal. The compromise, though, is that the image quality is not as good. Most people won't be able to tell the difference, but the image quality is somewhat less than full bandwidth NDI. And there's higher latency, so several frames of latency. So if you wanted to use NDI to go onto a sort of an iMac, one of the large screens inside of a production space or church or a large venue, that would have noticeable lag between what was being seen live and what was up on that screen. NDI, full bandwidth NDI, can get that down to just about a frame, so noticeable but not obnoxiously noticeable. However, because people liked the lower bandwidth requirement but didn't really care for the latency, there is a new flavor of NDI that has come out recently called NDI HX3. NDI HX3 is really a compromise between the two. It has very low latency, very similar to full bandwidth NDI, slightly more, but still very low. And it has better image quality. And again, these are all very close. For most people, they won't be able to see the difference in quality between the three. But NDI HX3 is better suited for people that don't want to go full NDI, but still want to be able to have the lower latency that comes with the protocol. So that's really that compromise. Now, inside this camera, we have both of these supported, HX2 and HX3. However, HX2, the sort of the lower bandwidth version of this with the higher latency, that covers all the way up to 4K 60. So you are able to push that out over the network direct from the camera. HX3, at least in the current incarnation of this camera firmware, is limited to 1080. So that means that if you 1080p 60, that means that that will be the limitation with sort of the lower latency. I'm not sure the technical reasons for having made that distinction, but just be aware that that is sort of a split between the NDI feeds, where once you get to HX3, it's 1080, HX2 is 4K. So one of the core features of the Move 4K is its ability to do motion tracking, and that is having the camera follow a subject as it moves in the field of view. And to cover this, we wanted to test the accuracy of this camera under several real-world situations. In addition to having a more complex background with multiple on-set objects, different lighting, and 2 video screens. So here's how the Move 4K did. So with one subject, the Move 4K was able to keep a solid lock, and it slightly leads the movement of the subject as they move within the frame. So it did a good job here with the single subject. So even with multiple subjects in the frame, the Move 4K was able to stay locked on to the target subject, even with both subjects moving. And in addition, when the target subject moved behind another subject and then reappeared from the other side, it was able to reacquire that target lock and continue tracking that target subject. So I think it did a very good job with multiple subjects. So in the real world, people can walk in front of cameras or just accidentally block them. So in this test, we wanted to see how well the Move 4K could reacquire its target subject when something like this would happen. So in this first case, we blocked the camera momentarily to make sure it stayed locked on to a stationary target. We then blocked it for a longer period and had the target move to see how long it took to reacquire, which it did fairly quickly, and then continued tracking. Using the included remote, you're able to tell the Move 4K to switch targets inside a frame. And as you can see, the camera, when you switch targets, there's a green box which shows it's seeking a new target and locks in. And it does that fairly quickly, but it works fairly smoothly. And when you get used to it, you're able to simply move between subjects and have the camera track them. And you can even track a subject that's partially off screen, as you see here, where we just grabbed the subject that was only an arm on the screen. So it works well in that regard as well. We feel that people that may be considering the Move 4K will likely be adding it into other cameras that they already have. And so what we wanted to do was show how the images from multiple different cameras could be dialed in so they could work together. And I think it's important to note that to do this, we didn't use a vector scope or any sort of professional mechanism for doing color matching. We did this by eye using a color calibration chart. There are going to be some variations in color between the different cameras, mainly given the difference in the sensors that are in each of the cameras. But we thought it was worth taking a look so you could see how a Move 4K could integrate with other cameras you may have. So in this example, we're using a Move 4K, a simple track light, a Gen 2, and a Sony FX30. And you'll notice that the colors, especially flesh tones, between the Move 4K and the Sony are very similar. And that's because they're both using Sony sensors. You'll also notice that in the Move 4K, the depth of field is slightly shallower, which gives you a bit of that blur in the background. So we think overall, you can easily match the Move 4K with other cameras. Well, we know you can't get a really accurate picture of the quality of these cameras through a video like this that's been encoded and re-encoded for going online. We wanted to just show you a couple of resolution charts from different cameras to give you a sense of the quality more as a comparative approximation rather than something an absolute chart would give you. So we set this up first with looking at the Move 4K. And you can see from there, that's just a sort of a resolution focus chart. Then we move to the simple track light. And that also, gives you something comparative. And finally, we use the Gen 2 camera as sort of our third example. But hopefully, when you look at the three of these, it just gives you a sense of the resolution quality within each of these cameras. And keep in mind that all of these were fed over NDI HX2. So we have even another level of encoding behind this. But hopefully, this is somewhat useful to you. Well, we've gone over many of the core technical capabilities of the Move 4K here. There were a few other capabilities that I wanted to mention as a part of this overview. And the first one is a setting inside the camera that allows you to hide camera moves. So what this will do is it will let you, when you hit a preset, have the video going out of the camera freeze until the new position and zoom of the camera is reached, and then start again. So what you effectively do during a move is hide the video and create a cut between the preset that you were on originally and the new preset that you went to. Now, while this isn't something I'd recommend as a aesthetic choice, it is something that can save you from the unfortunate situation of putting an unwanted camera move out in your live stream. So in the event that you accidentally pressed a preset for a camera that was already live, that preset movement is now hidden and the viewers will only see a cut. Now there is a freeze frame between that first position and the final position, but in many cases that can be much better than seeing an entire camera move stream out, especially if it isn't a gentle one, if it's swinging or doing very serious zooms at a fast speed. That can actually be very disruptive visually, and this is a great additional feature to have. So the second feature I wanted to mention is the ability to send HTTP commands to the Move 4K to turn the tracking on and off. And this can be really useful where if you want to control something manually for part of a production during part of an event, and then at some later point switch it over to auto track, especially if you're doing something where there may be multiple speakers and then you have a lecturer that will be talking for an extended period of time. That can give you that ability to move between them. And the fact it's HTTP enabled means that you can do this through an external trigger. And the trigger that we're really a big fan of are the custom buttons that are available on the PTZOptics SuperJoy. And I've made no secret about my affection for the SuperJoy. I'm really impressed with that as a piece of gear. And the fact that you can actually toggle the auto tracking on and off to a single custom button, all from the SuperJoy control surface, we think is a great feature and something that definitely should factor in to the usability and workflow side of integrating a Move 4K camera. Now, the third feature I'd like to point out is really subtle, but it's very, very valuable. And that is a built-in tally light right on the camera. So if you look at the top of the Move 4K, there's a tiny LED light there that will turn red when you are live in program. It'll turn green when you are moved to preview, and it will go off when you are not in either program or preview. So it works just like a traditional tally light, but having that there makes it so much easier for somebody that is moving between multiple cameras to know which camera to be looking at. And it's built right in a very subtle way. So it's easy to see when you're looking straight at the camera, but it's not interfering or distracting in any way. So we think it's a great sort of subtle feature that's built in, but a very valuable one. While we came away impressed by the capabilities of the Move 4K, there are two features that we'd like to see improved inside the firmware. And the first is within auto tracking. Currently, when you set the camera to auto track, it sets its own framing for the shot. So you typically get a fairly wide frame, which includes most of the subject, and it tracks from there, but it doesn't really let you compose a shot and then try to preserve that as it does the auto tracking. So in a future firmware release, we definitely would like to see some improvements on that front. The second thing that we'd really like to see, and this goes to our automation side here at Streaming Alchemy, we'd love to see more HTTPS or HTTP support for the commands to do the auto tracking. So right now it has auto tracking on and off via an HTTP command, but we'd love to see the ability to change subjects as well. So you could go and say, which is the target subject that I want for my tracking. It might be also nice to be able to turn on and off the bounding boxes that are put up so you can see what's being tracked at any given point in time. So you can know, for instance, if you changed who's the subject being tracked, which subject that is. And sort of in line with that, we'd also like to see some added capabilities in the RTMP or RTSP feeds that come out of the camera, so you could see those bounding boxes in the RTMP, but not see them in the camera output. So a few changes on the auto tracking space that we'd really like, but the capabilities of the camera, the quality of the signal, and most especially the quality of the auto tracking, we were really impressed with. Hopefully you found this overview of the PTZOptics Move 4K camera useful. We've tried to cover as much technical detail as we thought was relevant, and we tried to give you real-world examples for how this camera performs in scenarios you may actually run into in the productions you do. So any questions that you have, please just get back to us, post your questions in the comments, and we'll try to answer them. But we are grateful that you took the time to watch this video. See you in the next one. Take care.